So what I'm going to do today is walk through the guidance in a couple of ways. So we took the daytime summer camp guidance that was in effect over the summer and compared that to the updated child care and early education guidance, as well as the latest Ready School Safe Learners guidance for K-12. Try to have as much consistency as possible with public health and safety in mind. So what you'll see as I walk through this is I've tried to summarize basically what hasn't changed. So if it hasn't changed, I'll put that at the top and just kind of do a quick summary of what's in there. And then if it has changed, I'll note that in red. So hopefully it's pretty easy to follow, and then happy to answer questions. So to kind of ground us, we've added an applicability and definitions section. So the applicability currently states that this guidance applies to youth program operators, including day camps, for children over the age of 12. So youth programs that care for children from kindergarten to age 12 must register as emergency child care or become licensed and follow the child care and early education guidelines. So if you're going to be serving kids from kindergarten through grade 12, then you would be using a combination of this guidance. In terms of definitions, for the purposes of this guidance, we're defining youth programs to include day camps or any formal grouping of children from kindergarten through grade 12 for a defined period of daytime hours with teen or adult supervision outside of licensed child care programs. We're also noting, as so many of you have stepped up here, youth programs are playing an important role in supporting comprehensive distance learning for school-age children and are also providing an important source of childcare for many working families. Because day camps and youth programs are each unique, it is also important that hosting organizations refer to Oregon Health Authority guidance for parks, gyms, fitness facilities, and other guidance for spaces where they host camps. And it's essential that there's close collaboration between program organizations and other organizations where youth access activities and facilities. And these last two bullets were in the daytime summer camp guidance. So that shouldn't feel new to folks. And we've got some colleagues from OHA to help answer questions there as well. So the first section, as it is in the daytime summer camp guidance, is there has to be operational guidance, including a written communicable disease management plan, daily logs for each stable group of 10, restricting any youth or adult known to have been exposed to COVID, communicating about not bringing your child or staff to work if you've recently had an illness, reporting to and consulting with your local public health authority, and reporting to local public health authority any cluster of illnesses. So this is the same as is what's currently posted in the summer camp guidance. So there's no changes there. The only change we made under operational guidance is the summer camp guidance had stated that youth or staff who've had an illness or fever with a new cough should stay home for at least 10 days after illness starts, and it originally said until 72 hours after the fever is gone. This has been updated by the Oregon Health Authority to 24 hours, again, with public health in mind and to be consistent with the child care and Ready School Safe Learners guidance. So that's the latest guidance from OHA, so we've made that adjustment. Under general guidance, again, no changes here. So it's the same requirement to review and implement general guidance for employers, reminding staff and parents to keep themselves and children home if there's any illness involving fever, new cough, shortness of breath, providing hand washing facilities, reminding staff and youth to cover their coughs and sneezes, and minimizing contact during drop-off and pickup. That is stated exactly the same way as what's currently posted in the summer camp guidance. The one change we made is the summer camp guidance had said to advise that all persons wash their hands often and after blowing their nose, etc., with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. That's just been shifted to require, to clarify that the 20 seconds is required in washing hands, and of course we want everybody to wash their hands as often as possible. So that's the only shift in the general guidance. Face masks and face coverings. So this was updated mid-July after the statewide face covering guidance went out. So there's not a lot of changes here. Staff members must still wear a mask, face shield, or face covering. Youth of any age should not wear a mask if they have a medical condition that makes it hard for them to breathe, if they have a disability that prevents them from wearing a mask, if they're unable to remove the mask or if they're sleeping. There's been no changes to that section at all. Under screening for symptoms, again, most of this has stayed the same. Checking for a new cough, keeping campers away from others immediately if a camper or staff develops a new cough, fever, shortness of breath, or other symptoms. Ensuring flexible sick leave and absentee policies, reporting to and working with local public health about cleaning and possible need for closure, and reporting to local public health any cluster of illnesses. So that's exactly the same word for word as what's currently posted in the day camp, in the summer camp guidance. The couple of changes that have happened here. So if a parent cannot check a camper's temperature, we'll change this to youth. It's now been shifted to recommended that temperature is checked. That was a requirement in the summer camp guidance. That's been changed. While waiting for a sick camper to be picked up, we've added that the caregiver must wear a face covering. So before it just stated they needed to be in a room, we said an area. So if you're an outdoor space, you could be outdoors. But the adult staying with the youth until their parent comes has to be wearing a face covering and stay as far away as possible, at least 6 feet, while remaining in the same space. And again, you'll see here we've changed staying home for at least 10 days after illness starts and 24 hours after fever is gone instead of 72. So that's consistent there. Physical distancing, again, not any changes to this portion. Must be limited to maximum stable groups of 10. The stable group may change no more frequently than once per week. Stable groups consist of youth and staff. The number of staff needed for a group does not count towards the total of 10. So 10 just refers to the campers, the youth, the children in care. And staff should remain with a single group as much as possible. Ensuring that each group remains in the same indoor physical space and does not mix with another group when indoors. Again, minimizing the number of staff interacting with each group of youth. So that's exactly the same as what was in the summer camp guidance. The changes we've made is we've added a cleaning requirement to align with the Child Care and Ready School Safe Learners guidance. So frequently clean and disinfect shared equipment. This includes but is not limited to equipment such as art supplies, musical instruments, and mitts, using disinfectants that are included in the Environmental Protection Agency approved list for COVID. We've also added that we must ensure physical distancing requirements for special events to program. That was in place in the summer. We've added the facility limit that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So youth programs are limited to 200 youth in a facility during the course of the program week. So again, the adults with those youth, your teachers, your counselors, your aides, those do not count towards the 250 limit. This is just for the youth who are attending your program. Field trips, again, consistent here, avoiding travel with others outside your stable group, documenting the names of each cohort, allowing drivers to transport multiple stable groups if the driver wears a mask, face shield, or face covering and sanitizes hands before and after driving each stable group. Vehicles must be clean between each group of students, and youth and staff are seated in vehicles so that there's 3 feet of distance between people, so the same as it was in the summer camp guidance. The one change, which I know all of you have been aware of and we worked through this summer, but just explicitly stating that overnight field trips would not be allowed at this time. And it sounds like none of you have been planning on that, but just want to put that out clearly for folks. Food service, so consistent with summer camps, observing all food handling and storage protocols, ensuring youth and staff wash their hands with soap and water prior to eating, and encouraging youth to bring their own food if possible. And the stipulation that youth must be told not to share food with other youth in the program. We've added a couple of changes here to expand on some of these definitions. Again, this is in alignment with the Ready School Safe Learners guidance and the child care guidance. So we've added that self-service buffet style meals and sharing of food and drinks among staff or students is not allowed. If food is served by the program, staff serving meals and students interacting with staff at meal times must wear a face covering or face shield. And we've added a section at designated meal or snack time. Students may remove their face coverings to eat or drink, but must remain 6 feet of physical distance from each other and must put face coverings back on after finishing the meal or snack. This last section, miscellaneous, again, largely the same. Programs held in public settings must follow the general guidelines as above. If you have lakes at your facility, lakes should youth swimming in lakes should remain 6 feet apart. Programs must train staff prior to formal start of the program. And we're really pushing folks to be aware of child abuse and neglect trainings and recognition. And then the nature of group gatherings, again, it's sort of a statement here. It raises the risk for individuals with certain health conditions. So those who are in higher risk groups are strongly recommended not to attend these programs. Again, the same with the summer camp guidance. The only change here is there's been an adjustment. It used to say in the summer that if programs have on-site pools and are in phase 2 counties, they must follow the swimming pool guidance. That's no longer a stipulation. And we've added a clarifying element under the high risk factors, and the folks who are immunocompromised due to organ transplant is an addition from the Oregon Health Authority. So that's a lot, and happy to answer questions, and I'll encourage Shira from the Oregon Health Authority to jump in as well.
So I'll start with, thank you, Alyssa. We did have a question come in from Eric on one of the changes around the temperature checks, and so that it went to recommended. Just the discrepancy and rationale for having it be just recommended versus required for like childcare.
Yeah, absolutely. Shira, or I don't know if Dr. Sharif, if you've joined, want to weigh in from the health authority perspective on that.
This is Shira. I think Shimi is on.
Oh, great.
But she might be on mute. You might have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, here.
There you go.
So the recommended came from the fact that I wasn't actually the one weighing in. This was Dr. Dubé, who actually did propose that in an earlier version, and that was from the summer camp guidance, is because temperature checks can't be, they're not very specific for COVID-19. There are many people with COVID-19 who don't present ever with a fever, so they can only be considered an adjunct to other signs and symptoms. So fever alone can't preclude. But we did include the recommendation that if the parent of the child can't check the temperature, the camp could check it, with the caveat that a lot of these non-invasive thermometers that you don't actually insert into the mouth are very variable in their readings. So it's a recommendation just because we don't have the data to say that a fever alone can screen effectively for COVID-19, and so that's why it was changed to recommended as opposed to required.
Thanks. Does that answer your question, Eric? Well,
yeah, it does from a public health perspective. It doesn't answer the question of why, for those of us who manage or support programs that are, run the spectrum of, childcare to, this camp designation, just wondering how best to communicate that if you're serving children under 12, you must take the temperature, but if you're a camp over age 12, it's recommended. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's how the guidance is laid out at this time, and we can take another look at that across both sets of guidance to see if we want to pick one or the other for consistency across both.
Yeah, I think consistency would be good, and if the recommendation from the health authority is that the temperature check is not required, then we would want that to align across the board. Just because it could be confusing for folks to say, well, we heard it isn't required, yet it's in the early learning division guidelines as a requirement.
Yep, thanks for that, Eric. And we'll follow up with the senior health advisors who've been primarily focused on the Ready School Safe Learners and the early childhood guidance.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
So we had another question come in from Jordan around the differentiation between the childcare is up to 20 for school age, but camps remains at 10. Did you want to walk through the decision there? I think similar to summer camp, but Alyssa or Shira or...
Yeah, I'm happy to start and really defer to OHA on the final cohort number. So the childcare, obviously we're talking about younger ages, and my OHA colleagues can speak to kind of what the research is showing us. So that was in part what led to the decision of younger children being allowed in slightly larger stable cohorts, recognizing the operational issues of that we talked about last time with still a 1:15 ratio. So that's been some of the thinking, but Shira or Shimi, if you want to just speak a little bit to 10 for kids over the age of 12, please jump in.
So, I mean, at least from a health-related standpoint, the rationale for 10 for older children as opposed to 20 for younger children is because, as far as we know, based on the science that we do have available, the virus is much more transmissible, meaning it can infect people more readily in cohorts of higher age ranges. And also the virus tends to affect children of later ages more severely than they do for younger children. So that was the rationale for having two different cohort sizes.
Thanks, Shimi. And this cohort of 10 does align with the limited in-person instruction cohort requirements for K-12 and the Ready School Safe Learners guidance.
And then kind of to piggyback on that, Margie asked here around programs with a combination of ages. Would you do a combination of childcare and camp, or how might you distinguish?
Yeah, and if I don't answer the question, please follow up. I think, so there should be pretty consistent alignment with the exception of the temperature checks. We'll follow up on that. But between operationally what's happening between childcare and the youth programs, where we're seeing the biggest differences is in the cohort sizes. So I think functionally, and please let us know if we're not thinking about this correctly, functionally we'd envision that a program serving kids from kindergarten through grade 12 could have their cohorts of 20 for kids up to age 12. And then you'd have smaller classrooms or smaller group settings for your kids over the age of 12. But the daily logs in terms of what you're tracking and recording is the same in childcare as it is in camps. The transportation requirements, again, are consistent. The cleaning and sanitization is the same. So operationally, the biggest difference we noted would be the cohort differences.
I guess the differentiation that I was looking for is we mix our kids. So we have 5-year-olds in the same setting as kids that are over the age of 12. And so we do like teens as teachers, and they're mentoring the younger youth. And so I guess it's not really clear to me how that model would continue to work with these guidelines.
Yeah, that's helpful. And Shimi or Shira, feel free to jump in, but I think that's a question you can take back to the senior health advisors in terms of what guidance would kind of prevail if you're mixing age groups, what that would look like in terms of operating model.
From the discussions we've had so far, if there is an intention to mix age groups, we would err on the side of the more restrictive cohort size. I know this was logistically difficult in terms of if it's feasible financially to operate with smaller cohorts, but that's as far as we can recommend. If you're going to mix cohorts of different age groups, or on the side of the more restrictive cohort size, which would be 10.
Thank you.
And then just to reiterate, there was a question around like middle school day camps that include below 12 and above 12. And so, Jordan, did you have go ahead.
We can get clarity on that. I'm seeing Eric's question about, if it's 11 to 14 years old, what does that look like? So I'm happy to go back to the Early Learning Division and to Oregon Health Authority to see where we can potentially find some middle ground there.
And then to complement that line of questioning, so following the cohort size, but additionally, are there requirements to become ECC, to become an emergency child care center and be licensed if you're operating a with those mixed cohorts?
Yeah, I will check back with the Office of Child Care. If you've got more than 3 children from age, kindergarten to age 12 who are not related to the person caring for them, then that's child care. I don't believe the fact that they're mixed with kids who wouldn't fall under the child care umbrella would change that. So, but I will check in with the Office of Child Care on what that looks like from a licensing perspective.
And there's a question around particularly when you're mixing cohort or mixing ages because you're doing family-based groups, and so you have siblings that fall within the very ages. And Jane has a question over here on, is this guidance that would apply to outdoor programs and or camps, or is there going to be a separate set that comes out later?
No, so this would apply to any organization that's caring for kids from kindergarten, from beginning age 12 and over. So whether you're indoor or outdoor based, this would be the guidance that you follow. And if there's guidance that you need, if there's gaps, again, this was, we haven't taken anything out from the summer camp guidance, so this is what program should have followed in the summer with those changes I noted. But if there's something missing, let us know, and we can talk about that with the Oregon Health Authority if you need additional guidance. In terms of outdoor schools, because outdoor schools are their own entity, we're working with the Department of Education on that. So outdoor programs, outdoor camps follow this guidance. At this time, the outdoor school infrastructure would not, and ODE is working on what that looks like.
Great. And then I know there was like one caveat in the camp guidance around music and instruments being used. There's a question here on, is there any other specific guidance for youth music programs? Yeah, so there's a little bit of, I think that's the one I meant to go back and add. So there is some guidance in the Ready School Safe Learners guidance for K-12 that we may be adding. And that basically adds a condition. So additional steps should be taken, such as increasing physical distancing, more frequent cleaning, reducing the size of the cohort, or doing the activity outdoors. We'll likely include a link to where that's laid out in more detail in the Ready School Safe Learners guidance. So that is a little bit more clear. Thank you. I had a great question come in around staff participating in various cohorts throughout a week. So Jen puts it, I think, pretty well. For a single activity program, such as a dance class that has their cohort of participants for a week, but if there are multiple of those classes, is there a maximum amount of programs an instructor could teach in a week?
Yeah, so I think we would likely, this does allow for an AM and a PM option. So effectively, which was similar to what happened in the summer. So there could be, I believe, 2 cohorts, I'm checking, with cleaning. Let me check, in between. So yeah, so if a program hosts a morning and afternoon group, there's sanitization requirements that have to happen between those sessions that were in place in the summer as well. So one single space could hold a maximum of 2 stable cohorts per day.
And then if that staff person participated, like it was only a 2-day-a-week class and they had 3 different classes each day that they taught, or 2 different classes each of the 3 days. As long as they're wearing a face mask and cleaning, then that's okay.
Yeah, and Shira or Shimi jump in, but I believe that's how it worked in the summer, and that's similar to sort of the floater staff guidance that's been put forward with childcare as well. I don't believe we've put a limit on the number of cohorts an adult can interact with, just that we want them to be minimized as much as possible. I see Shira's head nodding yes. So.
Okay. We've got another kind of follow-up on the staff question. I think this is Umpqua Valley Boys and Girls Club. I don't know if it's Marcus or someone else, but did you want to ask your question? It looks a little lengthy and I can read it, but around how many stable groups can a floater visit to run activities during a program day? So it's kind of similar to what we're just saying, and the example given was if a staff member Z visits group 1 to run an activity and visits group 2 to run the same activity, and they're in separate spaces, is that to the cap or?
Bethany, I can clarify that. Sorry, we're having a side conversation. I didn't hear that was going on. So the question was, because we have AmeriCorps serving with us and they need to run their activities to live up to their national service. So we're wondering like how many stable groups can they visit to run that activity? Because they would have to enter the programming space, be with that group for a variable amount of time. And then they were wondering like how many groups can they visit within a programming day. And organizationally, our gut was like just probably 1. But we weren't sure if they could visit multiple stable groups. Yeah, even if they're following like the shedding layers between groups kind of stuff, just because they would be visiting so many groups. For us, like potentially 6 groups in one day. So, thank you.
Yeah, and Shira or Shimi, jump in. I think the preference would be 1 group per day. So if that's implementable and feasible, I mean, that the fewer groups that a staff person interacts with, the less risk of transmission between those groups, right? But we have not put a limit on the number of groups floater staff or a member like that could interact with. So as of right now, they could do all 6. I think the preference would be to reduce that as much as possible, but you would be able to operate that way.
Yeah, I think that's where our gut was in that mitigating risk. We were just 1 group, so cool. Thank you, Alyssa, for clarifying that.
Yeah, no problem.
And another consideration would be, I mean, limit as much as possible the number of groups, and also if the length of the interactions can be reduced, then that would also help with reducing transmission. So reduce to 15 minutes or less with at least 6 feet apart between the staff member and the child.
Yeah, we ran that calculus, and I think that's why it confirmed like our gut feeling, but we just wanted to ask just because like Alyssa alluded to, like it wasn't explicit in the guidance, but thank you guys for asking or answering the question rather.
We can be clear about that too. In the guidance, you can explicitly state that there's not currently a limit and include some of the mitigation techniques to try to employ, so that that's clearer for folks.
I definitely think that's helpful. It's always nice for people to reiterate the required versus recommended and what's behind that. And as long as staff are following protocols, then it's allowed. But if you really want to help reduce the tendency for transmission, then these would be strategies to follow. And then it brought up really shortly the last point on this slide. Actually, one of the questions that came in ahead of time was helping define interaction. So thinking about the staff that are interacting with multiple groups, and is there things like shedding outer layers or that would help mitigate or be recommended or required?
I will defer to Shira or Shimi if there's any recommendations aside from the face coverings that we could put forward or that you'd want to share.
Those are the only ones I can think of that have any evidence base behind. Could you clarify what you mean by shedding or layering?
So I think it was around like if you're going to be in with multiple groups throughout the day, if you have an outer shirt that you would take off to go visit another room and then put on a separate shirt, or if you're transitioning between spaces, so you're out in a completely shared space, is it beneficial to wear a jacket while you are walking through?
So for us to clarify again, sorry, we're having side conversations just because of the wildfires that are happening and we have staff members that are very concerned.
Yep.
So the idea is like we're using like shedding a layer for us means we have like pullovers that we're wearing that we're having like floating stuff where if they're gonna go visit a group and then take it off, and then that one pullover would be for group 1. They have a different pullover for group 2, stuff like that. And that's what we're thinking about for our AmeriCorps that's potentially going to be visiting these multiple groups, is that they would be able to shed that outer layer. In the same vein that like the person that's running the health checks has to do that, or like has like to wear like a smock or the apron or whatever. So we're trying to meet that that hurdle in the guidelines. And we're also considering that for like our staff member that's going to be running gym activities, because every group will be visiting them. And that was one of the side conversations that we were just having. Like, do they also need to be a layer when a group visits them? I mean, given the time and space duration, or not duration, the calculus for that. I mean, like, especially right now, because of like the wildfire, the air quality is not great outside. So they're running it all in the gym. Thinking like, you know, how do we mitigate risk there that every group is visiting one person? If the worst were to happen, like how can we contain that and make it easy for contact tracing and stuff like that? So, but, cool. Thank you guys.
From a public health standpoint, there's not a ton of evidence to show that there is transmission with especially fabrics. The evidence that we do have is that the virus can stay in place on hard surfaces, usually those made with metal or glass. So I would say the recommendation to, shed an outer layer of clothing or change kind of that outer layer of clothing between cohorts is not a requirement part of the public health division. But that said, we do see organizations go above and beyond, sometimes even our recommendations.
Yeah, we were thinking like it was put in there for organizations that are like working with infants or toddlers, that they would need to like have close contact with them. So that was one of like the things that we're kind of like, as a recorded program, trying to navigate the ELD's guidelines is kind of weird in that way, because we're working with much older children that, that aren't going to need physical touch as much. So that's what we're like, yeah, the layer thing is kind of weird, but we'll do it. So cool. Thank you for bringing the public health perspective on that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, this was about a consistency issue for us. We're not just dealing with, we have the younger kiddos, so there's going to be all of the early learning division guidance, and we have an older cohort of kids that's going to be in there. And we have staff who, need to be in those shared spaces. So really, what is, some of it's just about some of the language being a little bit vague and not like, what's the goal here when we're interacting? Is that somebody who walked through their gymnasium, through one of these dedicated spaces? Or is that something like, does our staff need to be prepared to have their, games room jacket or their gym jacket or whatever it is, so that we can make sure that we're compliant and consistent and giving the kids reasonable expectations when they're moving into and out of various programs, activities, and transition, hopefully back into school at some point.
Yeah, and I'm going to flag this as well for the early learning division to cover in an FAQ. But Shimi and Shira, correct me if I'm wrong, it would not be an expectation that if kids are transitioning to a space that they would have to have an outer layer that they shed, same with staff, that would not apply in these programs, or be an expectation in childcare as well, to my understanding. And I'll make sure that the Early Learning Division and Office of Childcare are able to put together an FAQ to that.
Yeah, and it's just about the staff, because we may have staff that's visiting those multiple groups like other people have mentioned, in those more shared spaces. And there's a big difference between a jacket and an apron, Yeah. So it's kind of a lot of variation there.
Nope, that's perfect.
And I just want to note, Stephen Price, you put in here that you had seen some differing information on the tendency for clothes to transmit or have did you want to share that with us, or
Yes, can you hear me?
yes?
So according to our conversations with Marion County Health, who obviously takes their cue from Oregon, the state of Oregon, the primary issue that we need to mitigate is actually exposure. Because anytime that anybody comes exposed to anything, they have to quarantine for 2 weeks, which shuts down the program or shuts down staff. And even though they may not even get infected or sick, the exposure itself is the underlying problem. So what we were told by Marion County Health Authority is that staff could work wearing full PPE for extended periods of time with students and avoid exposure. So we set up a protocol over the summer working with Marion County during our summer camp. And anytime a staff or student was not able to use what we call super social distance, which is 12 feet, because Marion County told us that masks don't count. Marion County Health told us that masks don't count under 6 feet or within 6 feet, especially if you're breathing the same air for an extended period of time. So with that in mind, we set up super social distancing where you can't breathe the same air with somebody for an extended period of time, and you have to be 12 feet away. But if a staff was unable to do that, like if they're working in close proximity with students, they're driving in the van with students, they're going classroom to classroom, serving multiple groups of students, then we required full PPE, which according to Marion County Health Authority was a surgical grade face mask, a face shield, a surgical grade gown, not a regular gown, but surgical grade, and rubber or neoprene gloves. And or any of the kind of the gloves are fine. But we had to have all 4 of those components. And if we had all 4 components, we could avoid exposure. What we found during the program is that after we opened on a Wednesday with staff, and we had to immediately shut down within 2 days because one of our staff had gone to a party over the previous weekend and gotten exposed. And then we had to all go into a 2-week quarantine because we had been, even though we were wearing masks, we were all in the library together, 6 feet apart, but all still in the same library. So, but Marion County quarantined us all anyway. So when we came back, we set up this new protocol, and then we had another exposure in one of our cohorts, but the good thing is that in that cohort, only the students had to quarantine. The staff who were wearing full PPE were not required by Marion County to quarantine. And so that was the kind of some of the lessons that we learned through this process, which I did. So that's why I didn't know if this was aligned with that, because I hear a lot of things that don't seem like they're aligned with what Oregon is telling. Like if you have the exposure and you have to call these people a lot, which the lady there knows me by name now, and she and I talk every week. So that's why I'm wondering if these have been vetted with the Oregon Department of Health, because to deal with exposure control, not just infection. That was my question.
So this is
Shira, feel
Shira from
free.
the Oregon Health
Yep.
Authority, and Shimi, please jump in as well. But I do know that our guidance that we have around summer camps, as well as, or that we've had around summer camps, as well as this draft guidance that we are developing right now for youth programming and those staff of those youth programs or the summer camp guidance, we have never explicitly said anywhere that they are required to wear full PPE. There's a statewide face covering, mask, and face shield guidance that we have on our website right now. That is what we are requiring operators of those summer camps, as well as their staff and the campers to follow. And so I don't know if Shimi, if you want to add any more in around.
It wasn't required. What we were told, though, is that anytime that there was an exposure, we would have to go into a 2-week quarantine. And so the only way that we could effectively run the program on an extended period of time was to take that step, was to have the full PPE. So it wasn't required, unless we didn't want to have to quarantine every 2 weeks that there was an exposure. And the problem is that now we're Marion County, we're a hot spot. We've had, we recognize that, and we've had every time we kept getting together, we had multiple exposures. And so in order to prevent having staff have to go into, sick leave all the time or whatever, when they're working with kids, this was what we had to do. At least that's what from our multiple conversations with Marion County.
So I think, and then Eric has a question or a statement over here. Just there's not really a statewide definition that he's found on direct contact. So when they've asked for direct contact or contact tracing, what does that mean and look like? So I think that, comes into play here with staff being able to call out and programs being able to continue to operate if there were cases or contacts, is what do programs need to be aware of, and having that really explicitly in the guidance for what works and what doesn't.
So to define contact, it's any interaction, meaning like any encounter where there's two people within 6 feet of each other, regardless if it's touching, just talking to each other, or just being within each other's presence. In terms of some of the questions about what constitutes adequate PPE to not be identified as a case or a contact for a contact tracing investigation, I'll take this question back to the rest of the senior health advisors, because as far as I know, the state of Oregon has only defined a protected interaction as being a healthcare professional in full PPE in contact with a COVID positive patient or a COVID positive or COVID suspected patient. But I would have to see what we define as appropriate PPE. For example, I'm not sure if a surgical grade mask, unless it's an N95, would constitute that kind of PPE. But to institute the use of N95 masks for the purposes of a childcare setting would not be feasible. And also, I don't think we have the supply chain to actually meet that demand in that kind of sector. So I can definitely take this question back to see if there is a way that, for the purpose of contact tracing in a county such as Marion County, if there are special circumstances to avoid being traced back as a contact if there is an exposure, or if that's something that we're unable to offer right now just because either we don't have the supplies to be able to meet that requirement, or that we just have limited evidence to show that use of this kind of PPE, surgical mask and surgical gown, are sufficient to rule out somebody as a contact. As far as we know, we're mitigating risk and reducing risk, but the risk does not come down effectively to zero, to say that this person who is gowned appropriately in that way would still not be considered a contact.
Okay, because we're just going off of what Marion County told us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as far as I know, this is an ongoing discussion with some of the counties also. So this came up very briefly in this morning's discussion, but I can loop this back to the group.
Well, overall, this has allowed us to implement some systems and programs that we wouldn't have been able to have otherwise. Like we're doing registration right now at our Welcome Center. We've got people who are doing testing in close proximity with kids, but they're fully gowned in full medical grade PPE based on what Marion County had told us, and we're told that we're okay.
I'm in a call with the governor's office, the Oregon Health Authority.
Christian, you're not muted. There we go. So thanks, Steve, for the questions and for taking it back to get more clarity. And I'll just note, Eric put a comment over in the chat box on perhaps what we need to be addressing is who needs to be included in a daily log sheet as far as staff interacting that we make sure to trace. Eric?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to put words in Stephen's mouth, but I think in particular the scenario of a library or a gymnasium or shared facility space, anybody who walks through the building, are they now, considered a contact that would then need to be in that log and then part of the contact tracing, and therefore, I think to Stephen's point, would be mandated to do a quarantine if there was exposure. I think that's come up a couple of times. I think we got on a conversation about PPE, which is really informational, but it doesn't really, I think the question probably is what constitutes being part of that stable group and therefore subject to, contact tracing and possible quarantine or restriction.
Yeah. So this is, I can put it in the chat for folks. The daily log requirements, I believe, are identical to what they were for summer camps. So it lists very explicitly that when it comes to adults, it is the staff that interacts with the stable group, including floater staff. It would not require you to run down a stranger walking through a publicly shared space to say we need to make sure we get your info for our log. It's just the folks that are interacting for a duration with the children. So I'm putting that in the chat here, but this should be exactly the same as what summer camps were asked to adhere to.
Thanks, Alyssa. And I just want to make sure we get on to a couple more questions, since I'm sure there are more clarifying on this that we can get to, but there was a question that came up from Jordan and Lake Oswego Parks and Rec around the cohort size. And I think this speaks to, I know we had this conversation in camp earlier on a stable group versus the max camp size. And if a space is large enough to fit multiple groups, can you host multiple groups in a space? So I don't know, Jordan, if you want to give more context or if there's a rebuttal, Alyssa, on will this be revisited?
Yeah, thanks for having me ask another question. I'm actually here with my recreation supervisor, and I think she can ask the question a little better.
So basically, we run a facility. It's a dedicated teen lounge. So it's basically a drop-in facility that we have that we are no longer doing drop-in. So it's membership only. We know who's coming. And we basically are in a position to be able to, with the large space that we have, be able to operate with all of the camp guidelines, but with the 20-person max of school program. So we're able to do basically everything, but we aren't able to open with just like 10 people in a lounge. And like I said, our space is large enough. We have distancing in place. We have cleaning protocols and all of that. And so I'm just kind of hoping and wondering if there's any opportunity to be able to sort of readdress a situation like that. There's also an issue of the fact that we host for junior high school kids, which could be all the way down from age 10 all the way up to 17. The majority of them are junior high school students. So they're like 10, usually 11, but this earlier in the school year, they're about 10 years old, all the way up until 14 or 15. And then as they get older, it definitely reduces as far as the number of kids that we have with that age group. But I'm just wondering the likelihood of maybe that being addressed. If it's a dedicated space, it's not being shared with anybody else, we're able to track if there's any chance of that.
I'll defer to Shimi or Shira if you want to speak from the health authority perspective on that cohort determination.
I know that in our draft guidance right now that we allow for multiple stable groups of 10 in one facility or site, as long as they can accommodate for that physical distancing for the number of youth hosted per each group. But that's going to look the same as what the summer camp guidance looked like. So it's going to be the 35 square feet indoors, 75 square feet outdoors. And then there has to be access for those youth to meals, restrooms, and activities without having to cross over to other stable groups, if that makes sense.
Got it. Yep, it does. Yep.
One thing to clarify is that whenever we outline 35 square feet, it's for usable space. So if there's like areas that you just can't access and you can't pull people in together, just make sure to exclude those areas of the room or the environment away from that 35 square feet of space that's available to actually interact in.
Yeah, we did that with our square footage, and that's basically what we're at. If once we get into different phases where we can actually go by square footage, we're at about 45. So.
Thanks for answering, and good question. There's just been a couple to reiterate on kind of the applicability of these guidelines. You went over that kind of on your first slide, Alyssa, but I think an ongoing question that will have come up is if you fall, where do you fall on the guidance, and where's the best way to find that information? Is there someplace online you can double check, or what constitutes a camp versus care, especially for that middle age group?
Yeah, Shira, is that something that could maybe be captured in FAQs once this guidance comes out on the OHA's website?
Can you repeat what the question would be? It's just so I can.
Yeah. Would we be able to kind of, if there's clarifying questions about, am I a camp? Am I supposed to follow the youth program guidance, or am I supposed to follow the child care guidance? Should we include that?
Yeah, we could have that in an FAQ.
Great.
And then to just clarify, if what was said, if there was multiple stable groups of 10 to share a large space, as long as they have dedicated access to separate restrooms. True.
Yes, and I'm pulling it up right now so I can look at it. They have to have access to or use of meals, restrooms, and activities that happen within that 10-person cohort. So they shouldn't be crossing over into spaces where other cohorts are to access those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep.
And is there a barrier? I know within childcare there was like a clear, some sort of barrier at least 4 feet tall to separate open spaces. Is that in camp guidance still? Or in camp?
I don't think we have anything in there about barriers specifically.
And then just to reiterate, a program offering a single subject enrichment program for less than 8 hours a week that's taking place outside of school hours is not required to be emergency childcare.
Correct. They should follow, in this case, they'd follow probably the youth program guidance, right? I mean, I think the goal here is health and safety. So our recommendation would be that they're following the sanitization requirements, you know, the logs and everything like that to support contact tracing and keep the kids safe in those settings.
So even if they were not required to be emergency childcare, so there's that question of, are they a 10-person cohort or are they a 20 school age cohort?
Yeah, we'll check in on that and also understand kind of with license exemptions, we're trying to figure out how to help folks have guidance when they're exempt from requirements. So I'll follow up to see if we can get some clear guidance on who has to follow something, who we can recommend should follow something, and which direction we point them in.
And then Eric has a scenario here for us. Within these two scenarios, if one child under the age of 13 in a group of teenagers, what is the group size limit and emergency childcare expectation? And if there's one child over age 13 in a group that is otherwise under 12, does that group size limit? And did you want to clarify, Eric, or do you want to take a stab at this?
No, I really don't. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I just this concept that age is going to determine, for instance, group size limits and emergency childcare designation is interesting to me, because I was going into this call thinking it was going to be based on the type of program. If it is going to be based on age, I think the middle school scenario is just a logical, one where we have youth that span that age. So I know you said you're going to look into whether there can be some supplemental guidance or FAQ that can address that. But I'm just wondering, in this scenario, for those of us, once again, who manage or support the full range of programs, should we be saying if you have one child under age 13, then you must be pursuing emergency childcare designation and the group size limits according to the ELD's health and safety guidelines? I'm wondering if there's going to be a threshold, or if it's just kind of one kid in that age range and you follow that other guidance. And then similarly, I'm going to forget the name, whoever just spoke about the teen lounge scenario. If it's a group of, young teens, does one 13-year-old now say, now we're, capped at a 10, group size of 10? Just wondering if the age is going to be the determinant factor, if there could be some guidance to kind of back that up.
Yeah, we can follow up on both those scenarios. What's the threshold? I can think through some possible answers, but I want to talk with the agencies about what that looks like, so that we can have some clarity and ideally get that baked into this guidance, if not prepped for an FAQ. But I think we want to try to add that clarity here before this comes out.
I appreciate it. And I think particularly because, you know, programming doesn't typically cut cleanly across age lines. I mean, just, you know, school is a good example. I mean, middle school, you know, it's not like there are developmental differences between an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old, clearly, but, you know, for the purposes of programming, you could have those two children in the same group or class or cohort. So clarity would be great. Thanks.
Yep, absolutely.
There's a couple questions in the chat box that I'll just kind of read out here. So from the Sherwood Center for Arts, I think this is correct, that an enrichment activity is something like a dance class or art class, karate, different from childcare because they do not take the place of parents' care. Correct. So that would not have to be emergency childcare.
Yeah, it's nuanced, but yes, it's a single activity, so it wouldn't be a different activity every day, because that would then be a camp or a youth program. But this would be one art class a week. Yes, that's an enrichment activity, and it's largely because of an hours threshold. So if it's less than 8 hours a week, it does not need to be considered childcare. So you would be fine with a different class, offering one class per week. That cohort is not childcare.
And then these guidelines would be applicable for programs under the age of 12 that were operating enrichment or camp, or, right, that's the idea, is if you're not a childcare, that you could use these.
Yeah, we'll add clarity to that. If you're in that sort of exemption space, we'll add the clarity about which guidance you should be following depending on the age.
Thanks. And I just noticed we're past 3 o'clock now. So thank you everyone for your hour of your time. Feel free to put more questions in the chat box. We'll capture those to send along to Alyssa and our wonderful team of OHA experts and professionals. I think, is there anything else, Alyssa, that you wanted to let us know as far as a timeline of when we should have final feedback to you?
Yeah, so I think we'll take some of these big questions back. I know Shimi's taking some questions back to the senior health advisors. I'll take some of these questions back to the agencies so we can get clarification. I think, you know, any additional questions or areas where we haven't been clear, if you could get those back to me by, you know, before noon tomorrow. I know everybody wanted this guidance a month ago, so we're also just trying to get this out the door to you all as quickly as possible. So Bethany, if they send them to you, feel free to shoot them over to me, and we'll try to get as many of those questions answered as possible. And then, as Shira said, we'll have an FAQ on the OHA site as we did for the summer camp. So if we don't get everything, then we'll have that FAQ that we're working on as well.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'll let everyone go and make sure we'll get questions in and hopefully clarifying FAQs and everything back out to you as soon as possible.
Great. Thanks, everybody.